confused about sexuality and spirituality? Let me start with this important distinction. We are not sexual beings, but spiritual beings.
Welcome to the Sifted Wheat Podcast with Leslie Lamb, a counselor by profession, a minister of truth, and a lover of people. This is a safe place where she sets a path for others to learn how to move through hard seasons with confidence and grace, encouraging your faith, empowering your choices, and challenging your perceptions through the Word, the wisdom from years of counseling others, and her own experience of being sifted. Here's Leslie.
I have heard well-meaning Christian leaders say that we are sexual beings. That always confuses me. How do they get that? What Bible are they reading that informs that statement? Because as long and as far as I've searched the Word, I come back to the truth. We are spiritual beings, not sexual beings. How do I know this? Well, first, God breathed into us His Spirit. That's what sets us apart from every other creation. No other creature received the spiritual breath of God. It's what sets us apart as being created in His image. Sex, or procreation, was something that they were invited to do. And it was a part of the proclamation made to them to multiply in the earth. But it was not who they were created to be. Why does that matter? If we think that our goal is to be complete sexually, we will not be good stewards of our identity or our purpose, and we will never feel complete. If we seek to satisfy our flesh, we're going to miss the beauty of fulfillment of the Spirit and the beauty of humanity. Why does this misunderstanding concern me? Well, I see it. It affects the community of the church, the connection of men and women, the way they see each other, the way that they identify one another, the way that they treat one another, where our engagement and relationships are focused more on romance instead of discipleships, where we're recognizing and we're condoning and also condemning behaviors that seem sexualized, but maybe they're not at all. But because our mindset is so geared towards sexuality, we miss components that are necessary for discipleship and connection with God to move us through those things that might be seeking our own desires and into those things that are seeking His will and His desires. It affects the witness of the church, both men and women, what they're doing, what they're saying, how they're presenting themselves. Because so often what we say is not in line with what we do. And even worse, we have reframed a toxic culture of sexuality into something that is both obligatory and shameful. How confusing is that? And the problem is we're growing a new generation who's already immersed in a sexual mindset and culture, and we're confusing them all the more by the way that we live this out in our everyday lives. If we're going to change the culture, it starts with us. And I'm not saying that we go and we raise banners or we have picket signs or we get on social media and we tell everyone what's wrong with the culture. I mean that we change the culture that we're a part of first. And when we change that culture, when we align it back to what is spiritually true, then we can actually make some truth-based changes in the way that we see one another. That's my drive to have this conversation. That's why I know that God is saying you need to put aside the sexuality and you need to re-invite and immerse yourself in spirituality, because I'm telling you guys, when it comes to where we're going to stand and how strong we're going to be when life gets hard, when the first world country that we live in potentially becomes a third world country, we're not going to be wondering about who we're sleeping with or whose ideologies are being accelerated and where freedom is. We are going to be more concerned about surviving. And we're going to need to know the spiritual truth that we are not a sexual being, but we are spiritual beings, and our power, our empowerment, our strength is not going to be based on anything that we might encounter physically. It is going to be rooted in everything that is spiritual. We need to know what it's like to be connected to the breath of God, the spiritual part of our being, so that we can stand firm when life gets hard. I'm sure you could talk to anyone and you ask them, when you came to the crux of your life and things got the most difficult, did you run to sex and did it fulfill you? Did you run to romance and did it pick you up? I don't think you're going to hear that person say yes. I think you're going to hear that person say that it was something deeper than that it was something more stable and more firm than that. I think you're going to hear them say that it was spiritual, because it is. All of these things will pass away, but the spiritual will remain. So that's why we have to talk about this, why it's important to talk about this, why God wants our eyes to be opened and our ears to hear the truth of who we are. Because when we know the truth will set us free. I want us to be free. Culture has used sexuality as a scapegoat. If there's dysfunction, we blame the body and our desires. It's who we are, we say. But is it? If we are spiritual beings with eternal souls, which the word says will not involve sexual relations, I'm sorry to say, do we cease to exist when our sexual needs vanish? Absolutely not. Any more than someone who doesn't have sexual desires is any less significant or real than someone who does. That doesn't even make sense. And yet, if sexuality is our identity, it would. I don't have all the answers. But when I sit with people, very rarely do we focus on what they need sexually. I'm not going to say never, because it is sometimes part of the conversation. But most often we discuss where they missed out in relationships and where others betrayed them, and their own sense of self, where they developed insecure, fear-based, or ambivalent attachments and seek comfort in others to replace those needs, or to direct those needs, or to fulfill those needs. Very often we discuss how they feel that they were betrayed in their bodies, and sometimes by their bodies, how they hold their bodies accountable for those hurts and unmet needs, and how they seek to satisfy or punish their body instead of consider the pain or the fear or the confusion that is stored there. I'm not drawing a line in the sand or saying that our sexuality doesn't matter, but it isn't the main thing. It isn't the eternal thing. It isn't why we were created or what we were created for. Jesus said, "Don't fear those who can destroy the body only, but the one who can destroy both the body and the soul." He's creating a parallel between the physical and spiritual and highlighting the importance of what is unseen over that which is seen. There's this weird place in the Bible, Genesis 6, if you want to look it up, where it says that the sons of God came down and had sex with the daughters of earth. First of all, this wasn't something commissioned or even condoned by God. Reading further, we discover that it appears to be an act of rebellion, and it seems to be directly connected to the fall of man as an introduction to increased violence and chaos and the consequent destruction of the earth through the flood. What we learn through this story and the words of Jesus is this: the body can be used as a spiritual means to access your soul. It's the access point where chaos and pain and confusion can enter and take over. Is it fair? No. Is it God's perfect plan? Also, no. In Ezekiel 18:28 and in Lamentations 3:33, God reminds us that He takes no pleasure in seeing us in pain or perishing. Rather, He delights in seeing us redeemed, living in freedom, wrongs righted, and justice walked out. In my own story, as I healed, I realized the source of pain that kept me in a toxic cycle of needing attention from men and feeling like I had to please them, and sometimes feeling like my own body was betraying me with attraction and longing. And it wasn't because I was a sexual being, but because at a very young age, my body experienced arousal that it was never intended to. That arousal wired things in my brain that held me spiritually captive, subconsciously and unconsciously for years. It wasn't until I began to unpack my pain, confess my confusion and fears and even longings that I was able to see that my sexual self had to be healed for my spiritual self to prosper. As one being counseled largely by the Holy Spirit, I came to see that correlation of both spirit and body. And as a counselor, I now understand it so much better. And daily I ask myself, Leslie, is this a trauma or hurt-based response or a healed response? Sometimes it's the hurt. And I have to walk myself back to healing and spiritual health to negotiate my choices differently. Look, I'm not invalidating anyone's experience or feelings because feelings are real, but they aren't always connected to truth and healing. We live in a world that's happy to tell you how to satisfy that itch or satiate that desire and offers you always more. But in all my years of counseling, I haven't had a single client tell me that their life got better when they prioritized sex and sexuality over mental and spiritual health, or that their spiritual lives improved with God after engaging more of their sexual longings. Instead, what I've heard more times than I can count was that it was a slippery slope, where desire led them into places that they never imagined going, where the world got darker and colors more subdued, and eventually they lost themselves. That's scary. I don't want that for a single one of you. That's why I'm saying what I'm saying. It's a dark hole. And deception seems to swirl around lust and desire. And I've been there. As we discussed in the Out of Order series, lust is the desire to possess and make one's own. And if we are going to value humanity and those around us, we can't see them and us as a means to a sexual end. That dehumanizes us. But more than that, it equates us to a body, and we are so much more than that. C.S. Lewis said, "We don't have a soul. We are a soul. We happen to have a body." The body will cease to be. It's a tent that is going to break down. Our desires will cease to be. Physical pleasure will cease to be, but the soul will live on. Much of my peace and joy have come from healing from sexual misinformation and identification into being loved and being known eternally, which I am convinced is what the soul is longing for. I want to dive deeper into this topic. I think we need to. If we don't start to value the spiritual over the physical and see the physical through spiritual eyes, we're going to continue to be hurt, to be led astray, and to lead others with us. We have to address our misinformed sexual education and discover how God intended it. I'll go ahead and admit I'm not an expert in theology. I don't have a seminary degree, but I have a pretty good grasp on people and a pure love for God and His Word. I want to see people helped and healed, not just validated or informed. I want to use my story to paint a picture of how trauma can turn us upside down in our thinking and how truth can set us free. So with this starting point, we're going to explore more about sexuality and the space where we need to see that misinformation and indoctrination mostly pushed into our physical world to interrupt our spiritual health is pornography. So the next topic that we're going to tackle is porn-informed sexuality. But don't worry, we aren't going to leave it there. We're also going to address expectations, perception, and attraction, including a conversation with the lovely Dr. Brooke Keels about platonic attraction. I want to leave you with a couple of questions to consider as we launch into this. Do I emphasize my sexual desires over my spiritual needs? Are there spaces where I can replace sexuality with deeper connection with God and others? And finally, am I giving access to the enemy through my sexual behaviors? Until our next conversation, follow Sifted Wheat on social media, leave a rating or review, and please Share these conversations with those you love. Thank you for connecting and remaining engaged in these conversations. And as always, I pray that you are seeking God and learning the process of healing.